The Guadalcanal campaign's conclusion marked a turning point in the Pacific theater, both strategically and historically, solidifying a shift in momentum from the Japanese to the Allies. Strategically, the campaign represented the first major offensive victory for the United States against Japanese forces, demonstrating that Japan's expansionist advance could be halted and reversed. Prior to Guadalcanal, Japanese forces had enjoyed a seemingly unbroken string of victories across the Pacific, from Southeast Asia to the Solomon Islands, instilling a sense of invincibility in both military circles and the civilian population. The success of American forces in holding Henderson Field and ultimately forcing Japanese withdrawal shattered this perception, signaling that the Allies were capable not only of resisting Japanese expansion, but also of projecting power effectively into contested regions. This shift in momentum had profound implications for subsequent operations across the Pacific, influencing strategic planning, resource allocation, and military doctrine on both sides of the conflict. The campaign also underscored the critical importance of logistics, supply chains, and industrial capacity in modern warfare. Guadalcanal revealed that numerical superiority and aggressive tactics alone were insufficient for success. Sustained operations required secure supply lines, reliable transportation, and the ability to maintain troops in hostile environments. For the Japanese, the difficulties of resupplying forces across extended sea routes exposed vulnerabilities that would recur in later battles, such as in New Guinea and the Central Pacific. Conversely, the United States demonstrated that a combination of industrial output, logistical coordination, and flexible operational planning could compensate for initial disadvantages in terrain familiarity and troop experience. Henderson Field became more than a runway for aircraft. It was a symbol of American capability to sustain and project force in remote and contested locations. Control of the airfield allowed the Allies to interdict Japanese supply efforts, conduct reconnaissance, and support ground operations, fundamentally shaping the strategic balance in the Solomon Islands and the broader Pacific. The historical significance of Guadalcanal also lies in its demonstration of the integration of combined arms and joint operations. For the first time in the Pacific theater, American forces effectively coordinated land, sea, and air assets to achieve a coherent strategic objective. Naval engagements, such as the Battle of Savo Island and the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, illustrated the critical interplay between surface fleets and air support, while ground operations highlighted the importance of engineering, intelligence, and close air support in overcoming entrenched defenders. This comprehensive approach foreshadowed subsequent American campaigns in the Central Pacific, including the island-hopping strategy that would bypass heavily fortified positions in favor of strategically vital targets. Guadalcanal provided a practical model for integrated operations, underscoring that success required synchronization across multiple domains rather than reliance on isolated force elements. The campaign's impact on Japanese strategy was equally profound. The repeated failures to dislodge American forces forced a reevaluation of offensive doctrine, emphasizing the limits of frontal assaults and the necessity of coordinated, well-supported operations. Japanese commanders became increasingly aware that aggressive tactics without adequate preparation and supply could lead to catastrophic losses. Guadalcanal also revealed the strategic implications of attrition. Even when individual units demonstrated bravery and skill, sustained losses over weeks of combat gradually eroded operational capacity. This understanding influenced subsequent Japanese decisions, including the cautious defense of fortified positions in the Central and Western Pacific, and a more conservative approach to committing forces in battles where the logistical and industrial balance favored the Allies. The psychological effect of the Guadalcanal defeats undermined the aura of invincibility that had long accompanied Japanese military culture, reshaping planning, morale, and public perception. From a historical perspective, Guadalcanal holds significance for its role in shaping the broader narrative of the Pacific War. The campaign became a symbol of American resilience, adaptability, and emerging dominance, highlighting the ability of a democratic, industrially advanced nation to mobilize resources, innovate tactically, and persevere under adverse conditions. The experiences gained by Marines, soldiers, sailors, and aviators during the campaign informed training, doctrine, and leadership across subsequent operations. Lessons in jungle warfare, amphibious assault, combined arms coordination, and the handling of disease and environmental challenges provided a foundation for success in later campaigns, including Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. Guadalcanal thus served as both a crucible for developing American operational proficiency and a template for executing complex, multi-domain campaigns in the Pacific. The campaign's influence extended beyond purely military considerations to affect political and diplomatic dimensions of the war. The ability to secure and hold Guadalcanal reinforced confidence among Allied leaders in the Pacific strategy, bolstering morale and validating commitments of resources and personnel. At the same time, Japanese failures on the island contributed to internal tensions and debates over strategy, priorities, and resource allocation, exposing vulnerabilities in leadership and planning. The psychological dimension of victory and defeat on Guadalcanal resonated with both populations. Americans gained a tangible sense that Japan could be challenged and defeated, while the Japanese public and military leadership were forced to confront the reality that their previously unchecked advance was now under serious threat. This interplay of military success and psychological impact highlights Guadalcanal's broader significance as a transformative event that influenced perceptions, policy, and the course of subsequent operations. The operational lessons of Guadalcanal also informed broader Allied strategy regarding amphibious warfare and island-hopping campaigns. By demonstrating the effectiveness of seizing strategically vital positions, establishing airfields, and denying resources and lines of communication to the enemy, the campaign provided a practical template for bypassing heavily fortified positions in favor of operationally advantageous objectives. This approach would define the next phase of the Pacific War, where selective engagement, control of key logistical nodes, and coordinated multi-domain operations became central to Allied strategy. Guadalcanal, therefore, was not only a battle for a single island, but a testing ground for broader strategic concepts that would be applied across the Central and South Pacific, shaping the trajectory of the war toward eventual Allied victory. In addition, Guadalcanal's legacy influenced the evolution of military doctrine regarding the interplay between environment, disease, and combat effectiveness. The campaign underscored the reality that tropical diseases, malnutrition, and harsh terrain could be as lethal as enemy fire, reshaping planning for troop deployment, medical support, and logistical preparation. The United States and its allies learned to prioritize preventative medicine, field sanitation, and adaptive supply chains, while Japanese forces struggled to mitigate these challenges. These lessons would resonate in subsequent Pacific operations, contributing to an understanding that mastery of the environment was inseparable from operational success.
Guadalcanal thus reinforced a holistic approach to warfare, integrating human, material, and environmental considerations into strategic and tactical planning. Furthermore, Guadalcanal's strategic significance extended to its impact on the broader Allied campaign in the Pacific. Securing the Solomon Islands created a critical stepping stone for advances towards the Philippines, New Guinea, and ultimately Japan itself. The island became a hub for projecting air and naval power, enabling the Allies to disrupt Japanese communications, interdict supply lines, and establish staging areas for future operations. Control of Guadalcanal shifted the initiative to the Allies, forcing Japanese forces into a defensive posture that would persist throughout the remainder of the war. This strategic advantage not only accelerated the timeline of Allied operations, but also demonstrated the cumulative effect.
When General Kuribayashi's plans began to take shape, Iwo Jima itself became his weapon. The island's volcanic pour, once a curse, would now serve as his shield. Beneath its blackened surface, his soldiers labored day and night, transforming the desolate rock into a vast subterranean citadel, a fortress invisible from the air, immune to naval bombardment, and waiting in silence for the coming storm. The work was brutal beyond description. The Iwo Jima volcanic soil was not soil at all, but jagged rock mixed with sulfurous ash that burned the skin and filled the lungs. Temperatures underground could reach over 60 degrees Celsius, and oxygen was scarce. Men dug with pickaxes and shovels, sometimes by candlelight, surrounded by the hiss of escaping gas and the echo of their own coughing. Many fainted from exhaustion. Some were buried alive when tunnels collapsed. Yet, under Kuribayashi's relentless drive, construction continued. His vision was absolute, a defensive system that would force the Americans to fight not against a line of soldiers, but against the island itself. By late autumn 1944, the island had become a warren of tunnels. Over 18 kilometers of passages connecting nearly every strong point on Iwo Jima. Each cave and bunker was designed with purpose. Some held machine gun nests and artillery pieces. Others served as barracks, hospitals, and command posts. Entrances were disguised with rocks and camouflaged netting, invisible even to the low-flying reconnaissance planes that circled daily overhead. The deeper tunnels could withstand direct hits from 2,000-pound bombs. In one report, an American pilot described dropping dozens of tons of ordnance on Mount Suribachi, only to see no visible effect. "The mountain just swallowed it," he wrote. That was exactly as Kuribayashi intended. Mount Suribachi, rising at the island's southern tip, became the heart of this underground network. Kuribayashi ordered engineers to carve galleries into its cone, creating firing ports, command centers, and storage rooms. From there, observers could see nearly every inch of the beaches where the Americans were expected to land. The mountain's artillery could pivot to strike in any direction, and its tunnels allowed defenders to retreat, reappear, and strike again. For the men stationed inside, it was both fortress and tomb, a place where they knew they would likely die, but where their deaths would carry meaning. Across the island's central plateau, more bunkers sprouted like dark blisters on the landscape. Colonel Ichimaru, commander of the naval detachment, fortified the northern sector,
while Colonel Nishi, a former Olympic equestrian champion, supervised the construction of defenses in the west. Their sectors were connected through narrow corridors and communication lines buried deep below the surface. The entire island was thus transformed into a single, interlocking web of firepower. Each position was designed to support another. Each fallback point was covered by crossfire. Even if one bunker fell, the defenders could retreat unseen, rejoin their comrades, and resume the fight from a different angle. Kuribayashi's genius lay not in innovation for its own sake, but in his understanding of inevitability. He knew he could not win, but he could make the Americans bleed for every meter they gained. To achieve that, he needed time and discipline. He forbade premature engagements, ordering his men to conserve ammunition and remain silent even under bombardment. When the daily American bombing raids began, sometimes lasting 10 hours or more, his soldiers sheltered inside the tunnels, listening to the earth quake around them. They emerged only when the sky fell quiet, counted their dead, and went back to work. Supplies were scarce, and food was rationed to bare survival levels. The men subsisted on rice balls, canned fish, and the occasional stolen fruit from the few scrubby trees that clung to life in the volcanic soil. Fresh water was a treasure. Some units survived by collecting condensation from tunnel walls or boiling rainwater tainted with ash. Diseases spread: dysentery, heat exhaustion, respiratory infections, but there was no medicine to spare. The island's 2 small hospitals operated in the dark, their air filled with the stench of gangrene and sweat. Yet Kuribayashi's discipline never wavered. He made rounds through the tunnels whenever possible, offering brief words of encouragement to soldiers who had not seen daylight in weeks. He told them, "You are the shield of Japan. Your endurance gives strength to the homeland." Every aspect of life underground was governed by order and ritual. Each morning, before the men resumed digging or repairing fortifications, they stood at attention in the flickering light of lanterns and recited the emperor's rescript on the imperial army. Letters from home were rare, but whenever one arrived, it was read aloud and shared, a brief connection to a world they would never see again. At night, songs of the homeland echoed faintly through the tunnels, melancholy tunes about cherry blossoms, mothers, and distant mountains. Some wrote farewell poems on scraps of paper, sealing them in bottles or hiding them in the earth. Others simply carved their names into the rock beside their posts. Kuribayashi's leadership style was unlike that of most Japanese generals. He treated his soldiers as men, not expendable tools. He forbade officers from striking their subordinates, a revolutionary act in the imperial army, and ordered that food and water be distributed equally, regardless of rank. He shared his rations and slept in the same conditions as his troops. His presence inspired both fear and loyalty. Fear because he demanded perfection. Loyalty because he lived by the same standards he imposed. Those who served under him later recalled that his calm confidence gave them strength. They said, "He never shouted. He simply looked at you, and you wanted to do better." Outside, the American air raids intensified. For 74 consecutive days, Iwo Jima was bombed without pause. Battleships and cruisers shelled the island from beyond the horizon, their guns thundering day and night. The once black soil turned gray and molten, the ridges flattened, the surface pitted like the moon. But the defenders were underground, waiting. The bombardment destroyed almost nothing of value. Most of the Japanese installations were too deep to be reached. From his command post, Kuribayashi listened to the distant tremors with detached calm. Each explosion, to him, was proof that his plan was working. The Americans were wasting ammunition on ghosts. Inside the tunnels, however, the psychological toll was immense. The ceaseless noise, the darkness, the claustrophobic heat, all conspired to erode sanity. Men began to hallucinate. Some whispered of hearing voices in the rock. Others claimed to see lights that were not there. Yet discipline held. The fear of dishonor, the belief in duty, and Kuribayashi's unyielding will kept them anchored. They clung to the idea that every hardship endured underground was a sacrifice that would buy time for Japan's defense. As weeks turned into months, Kuribayashi completed the final preparations. He positioned his artillery with mathematical precision. Every gun was zeroed in on a specific grid, every possible landing site surveyed. He knew where the Americans would come ashore before they did. When the invasion fleet appeared, his men would already have their sights aligned. He issued one final directive: no fire until the beaches are full. He wrote, "Let them come ashore. Only when the sand is crowded with men and machines will we begin the battle." By early February 1945, the island was ready. Beneath the ground, more than 21,000 soldiers.
At dawn on February 19, 1945, the horizon beyond Iwo Jima shimmered with steel. The sea itself seemed to move, alive with the shapes of hundreds of warships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, and transport vessels, stretching as far as the eye could see. The American invasion force, Task Force 58, was the largest armada ever assembled for a single operation in the Pacific. Over 500 ships and nearly 70,000 men of the U.S. Marine Corps were converging on an island barely 8 square miles in size. To the Americans, it was another stepping stone toward Japan. To the men inside the tunnels, it was the end of the world approaching on waves of fire. The bombardment began at 6:40 a.m. The ocean erupted in flame as the guns of the battleships Tennessee, Nevada, Idaho, and Texas opened fire. Shells the size of small cars screamed overhead and slammed into the island, throwing up geysers of smoke and ash. Naval observers described Iwo Jima disappearing beneath a living storm of explosions, every ridge and slope engulfed in dust and flame. High above, squadrons of carrier planes swept in to strafe the beaches and drop bombs. The air shook with the combined fury of sea and sky. Inside the tunnels, Kuribayashi's men waited. They had endured 74 days of bombardment before. They knew this was only the beginning. The earth trembled continuously. Rocks fell from ceilings, lamps flickered, and the air filled with grit. Some men covered their ears and whispered prayers. Others sat motionless, eyes closed, conserving strength. Kuribayashi, in his command post beneath the northern plateau, stood calmly, smoking a single cigarette as reports filtered in through field telephones. He ordered radio silence. He said, "Let them waste their shells. No one fires until I give the signal." At precisely 8:59 a.m., the naval bombardment ceased. The sudden silence was almost unnatural, a pause in which the only sound was the rustle of wind over the scorched island. Then, from the sea, the first wave of landing craft began to move. Amphibious tractors, or Amtraks, churned through the surf, carrying the men of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions toward the black volcanic shore. Thousands of Marines crouched inside, weapons clutched, staring at the dark strip of land ahead. Many expected little resistance. For 3 days, the Navy had pounded the island into dust. Intelligence officers had reported few signs of life. Quote, "There couldn't be a Jap left alive on that rock," unquote, one officer said confidently. But Kuribayashi's silence was deliberate, the stillness of a coiled serpent. At 9:02 a.m., the first Marines hit the beach. They stepped out into sand that was not sand at all, but fine volcanic ash, soft and treacherous. Each step sank ankle deep, and the weight of packs and ammunition dragged them down. The air was thick with sulfur, hot and choking. At first there was only confusion. No enemy fire, no visible movement. Landing craft after landing craft poured men and equipment to shore. Bulldozers began to move forward, cutting crude roads. Tanks rolled out of the surf. Officers raised their binoculars toward Mount Suribachi, its slopes eerily quiet. Then, at 10 a.m., Kuribayashi gave the order. From the mouth of every hidden tunnel, from caves, pillboxes, and unseen ridges, the island itself erupted. Dozens of machine guns, mortars, and artillery pieces opened fire in perfect unison. The beaches, crowded with Marines, vehicles, and supplies, instantly became killing grounds. The rattle of heavy machine guns merged with the crash of mortars. Shells burst among the landing craft, flipping them like toys. Men fell in waves, some dragged into the ash by their comrades, others disappearing in explosions. The air filled with screams, the hiss of tracers, and the choking dust of pulverized earth. Kuribayashi's trap had sprung exactly as he planned. He had waited until the Americans were fully committed, pinned between sea and land, before unleashing his firepower. His artillery, hidden in caves and disguised positions, struck from all directions. There were no visible gun flashes. Each weapon fired briefly, then disappeared back into its tunnel, sealed behind steel doors. American naval gunners tried to return fire, but found nothing to shoot at. The island seemed alive, firing from invisible mouths. On the beach, chaos reigned. The fine volcanic ash offered no cover, no foothold, and no stability for vehicles. Tanks bogged down, flamethrowers jammed, and communication lines were shredded. Officers shouted orders that vanished in the noise. Men clawed at the sand to dig shallow trenches while sniper bullets cut through the haze. In the first hour alone, hundreds of Marines were killed or wounded. Quote, "We were pinned down like targets on a range," unquote, one survivor recalled. From his underground command post, Kuribayashi monitored the battle through field telephones and spotters stationed across the island. He rarely raised his voice, issuing calm, precise instructions. Quote, "Shift fire to the second beach line. Let the first wave burn," unquote. His strategy was to break the momentum of the invasion, not by repelling it, but by stalling it, forcing the Americans into a slow, grinding advance where every cave, every ridge would become a miniature battlefield. For the Marines, the realization came swiftly and brutally. The bombardment had done nothing. The island's defenses were intact, its garrison unbroken. Every time they silenced one gun, another opened fire from a different direction. Progress was measured in yards, each one purchased with blood. Naval gunfire support was called in repeatedly, but the effect was minimal. Even napalm barely penetrated the volcanic rock. Quote, "They were ghosts,
You'd shoot into a hole and nothing would happen. Then fire would come from behind you." Unquote. As the day wore on, the beach turned into a landscape of wreckage. Burning Amtraks smoldered in the surf. Bodies lay scattered among shattered vehicles. Medics crawled through the open, dragging the wounded to improvised shelters. Overhead, the Japanese anti-aircraft guns struck down several American planes. Still, the Marines kept coming, wave after wave, their discipline unbroken despite the carnage. By sunset, nearly 30,000 men were ashore, but they were trapped in a narrow strip of beach, unable to advance beyond a few hundred meters. Kuribayashi's men fought with grim precision. They had been told that death was inevitable, but each bullet must carry meaning. They fired only when certain, conserving ammunition. Many had trained for months in the tunnels, rehearsing the ranges and angles of every gun. They knew the terrain intimately, could navigate the darkness by memory alone. When an American flamethrower finally reached one of the lower caves, the defenders counterattacked from an upper tunnel, emerging behind their enemy. It was warfare unlike anything the Marines had ever experienced. Not a frontal clash, but a slow dissection by an unseen foe. Night brought no rest. The island burned with a dull red glow, the air heavy with the smell of sulfur and flesh. Sporadic firefights continued in the dark as Japanese patrols emerged through hidden exits to harass the American perimeter. The Marines, exhausted and sleepless, realized they were not fighting men who intended to retreat. They were fighting men who intended to die. In his bunker, Kuribayashi wrote a brief report to Tokyo, transmitted via coded radio. Quote, "The enemy has landed in great strength. Our defenses are intact. We are inflicting heavy losses. Morale is high. We fight for the emperor." Unquote. He knew the outcome was already sealed, but he would fulfill his mission to the end. His officers shared the same fatal clarity. Colonel Nishi's tanks, half-buried in volcanic sand, served as immobile fortresses. Their cannons fired until the barrels glowed red. Colonel Ichimaru directed his naval infantry with cold efficiency, his men emerging from tunnels only to disappear again like shadows. By the third day, the Americans had gained barely a mile. Mount Suribachi loomed over them, spitting fire. For every position taken, a dozen more waited. The cost was staggering. By the end of February 20, more than 2,000.
By mid-March 1945, Iwo Jima was a wasteland of ash, steel, and corpses. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and death, and the ground trembled constantly under the impact of American bombs and naval shells. The Japanese garrison had been reduced to scattered groups of starving, wounded men, fighting from collapsed tunnels. Yet even in that hopeless darkness, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi continued to lead, not from a command bunker far from the front, but among his soldiers, sharing their hunger, exhaustion, and despair. His radio messages to Tokyo had long ceased. There would be no reinforcements, no escape, and no surrender. By the first week of March, Mount Suribachi had fallen, and American flags fluttered over the southern ridge. The Marines pushed steadily northward, sealing every cave, clearing every trench. Flamethrowers roared into dark tunnels, while demolition teams buried entrances with satchel charges. Each meter of advance cost lives, and every night brought sudden counterattacks from below the ground. Kuribayashi had long expected this end. He had written to his wife that he would never see her again, and that the life of a warrior is but one long farewell. His only goal now was to prolong the fight, to make the enemy pay in blood for every step they took. Inside the shrinking Japanese perimeter, discipline began to erode under the weight of starvation and shell shock. Communications failed, and ammunition was almost gone. Some junior officers begged permission to launch banzai attacks, desperate for a clean death under the open sky. Kuribayashi refused them all. He told them, "We will die in the shadows. We will fight until we can no longer fire a single shot." To him, throwing lives away in futile charges was dishonor disguised as valor. He believed that true loyalty lay in fulfilling one's duty to the end, even in silence and agony. Among those who still fought beside him was Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi, the Olympic gold medalist and charismatic cavalryman who had once competed in Los Angeles in 1932. His elegant manners and love of horses had once made him a symbol of Japan's cosmopolitan spirit. Now he commanded a shattered tank unit, his eyes blind from burns, his uniform in tatters. He and his remaining men fought from a cratered ravine, using wrecked tanks as fixed gun positions. When his position was finally overrun, Nishi's voice was heard shouting encouragement until a final explosion silenced him. His death became a legend among the defenders, a nobleman's end on a nameless volcanic rock. Kuribayashi's command post, once a labyrinth of tunnels near the northern sector, was reduced to rubble. He moved constantly between positions, encouraging the wounded and organizing the last reserves. His men described him as calm, his voice steady, even as the walls shook with detonations. He still carried his pistol, polished and clean, though he rarely used it. For him, leadership was no longer about victory, but about dignity in defeat. "If I must die," he reportedly said, "let it be with my men, not behind them." On the night of March 25th, the inevitable end arrived. The Americans had declared Iwo Jima secured days earlier, but hundreds of Japanese survivors were still alive underground. That night, Kuribayashi gathered the remnants of his garrison, around 300 men capable of standing, and prepared for one final assault. Without bugles or banners, they crept through tunnels toward the American rear near Airfield No. 2. Just before dawn, they burst from the earth in a sudden, disciplined attack. Unlike earlier reckless charges, this was silent and surgical. Grenades rolled into tents, bayonets slashed through the dark, and machine gun bursts ripped across the runway. Over 100 Americans were killed before the counterfire crushed the assault. Witnesses described it as both terrifying and tragic. Ghostly figures in ragged uniforms, emerging from smoke with fixed bayonets, shouting no slogans, only the guttural cries of men who knew they were already dead. The Americans responded with overwhelming firepower. By sunrise, the last resistance was over. Kuribayashi was gone. Some said he fell leading the charge, others that he ordered his aide to shoot him rather than be captured. His body was never found. Only a blood-stained sword and fragments of a pistol were recovered near the site of the final attack. When the island finally fell silent, barely 1,000 Japanese soldiers remained alive, most too wounded to move. Out of more than 21,000 defenders, nearly all had perished. The Americans buried their dead on the same black sands where they had landed 36 days earlier. For the Marines, it was the costliest battle of the Pacific, nearly 7,000 killed and over 19,000 wounded. But even in victory, few felt triumph. They had faced an enemy who had fought not for conquest or ideology, but for duty and honor to the end. Kuribayashi's death marked more than the fall of Iwo Jima. It marked the end of an old code. He had tried to redefine what it meant to die for one's country,
rejecting the senseless suicides that had characterized Japan's earlier battles. To him, courage was not in shouting banzai into machine gun fire, but in enduring, in fighting smartly, in holding out even when all hope was lost. In the silence of his last night, amid the sulfur smoke and falling ash, he fulfilled his vow. He made his stand as a soldier, not a fanatic. Today, the exact spot of his death remains unknown, buried somewhere beneath the volcanic soil of Iwo Jima. But his legacy lives on, in the letters he wrote to his family, in the tunnels that still scar the island, and in the respect even his enemies granted him. American officers later described him as the most formidable and honorable opponent we ever faced. In the end, Kuribayashi and his men achieved what no strategy textbook could measure. They forced the world to confront the terrible price of honor and the futility of a war already lost.
When the guns finally fell silent on Iwo Jima, the island was little more than a scar in the Pacific, a wasteland of black ash, twisted metal, and the bones of more than 26,000 men. The volcanic air still smelled of sulfur and cordite. American bulldozers rumbled across the island, leveling what was left of the Japanese fortifications, burying tunnels that had become tombs. Beneath that scorched surface lay the remains of General Tadamichi Kuribayashi and his men, an entire army swallowed by the very earth they had defended. The war moved on toward Okinawa, but the shadow of Iwo Jima lingered, casting questions that no victory could easily answer. For the United States, Iwo Jima was a triumph paid in blood. It was the first battle in which the American flag was raised on Japanese soil, immortalized in Joe Rosenthal's photograph atop Mount Suribachi, an image that came to symbolize sacrifice, unity, and the relentless drive toward victory. But behind that triumphant silhouette of 6 Marines hoisting the flag lay a quieter truth. The cost of taking 8 square miles of rock had nearly broken the Marines. Over 26,000 American casualties for an island barely visible on most maps. For many veterans, it was not a victory to celebrate, but a nightmare that haunted them for the rest of their lives. For Japan, Iwo Jima was both tragedy and revelation. Kuribayashi's unorthodox strategy, his refusal to waste lives in futile banzai charges, his focus on defense and discipline, stood in sharp contrast to the earlier Pacific battles. He had proven that honor did not require blind death, that courage could coexist with logic and restraint. Even as Tokyo's militarists demanded glorious sacrifice, Kuribayashi had quietly rewritten the code of Bushido for a modern age. Fight with intelligence. Die only when there is no other choice. His soldiers obeyed him not out of fear, but out of respect. And even in their annihilation, they achieved what he had intended. They forced the Americans to pay dearly for every inch, shaking confidence in the idea of an easy victory over Japan. The lessons of Iwo Jima reached far beyond that small island. In Washington, military planners studying the battle were horrified by the casualty estimates it implied for a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. If 21,000 defenders could inflict such losses on seasoned Marines, what would await them on Kyushu or Honshu, where millions of soldiers and civilians were preparing to resist? It was not Iwo Jima alone that led to the use of atomic bombs later that year, but it made the logic of total destruction more conceivable. In that sense, Kuribayashi's defiance shaped the course of history, pushing the war toward its most terrible conclusion. Yet his influence did not end with strategy. After Japan's surrender, many officers who had survived other fronts began to speak of Kuribayashi's example with reverence. He had been both a realist and a humanist, a man who refused to allow patriotism to devolve into madness. In his final letters to his wife and children, later recovered after the war, he wrote not of hatred or vengeance, but of love. "I have done all I could for my country. Do not mourn me too long. Raise our children to be kind, not cruel." Those letters, preserved and later published, humanized a figure once shrouded in myth. They revealed a man who understood the futility of the war he was fighting, yet still chose to fulfill his duty with grace and courage. In the decades that followed, Iwo Jima became sacred ground for both nations. The island, renamed Iwoto in 2007 to restore its original pronunciation, remains under the administration of the Japan Self-Defense Forces, but is still dotted with American memorials. Each year, small joint ceremonies bring veterans and descendants together to honor the dead of both sides. The tunnels where Kuribayashi's men fought are now sealed, but the volcanic soil continues to yield relics, helmets, bayonets, letters written on scraps of cloth. For the Japanese, these are not trophies of war, but fragments of memory. For the Americans, they are reminders that even an enemy can possess honor. Culturally, the story of Iwo Jima has been retold many times, yet perhaps never more powerfully than in Clint Eastwood's 2006 film Letters from Iwo Jima. Told from the Japanese perspective, it restored Kuribayashi's humanity to the global stage. Actor Ken Watanabe's portrayal captured the quiet dignity of a man torn between duty and compassion, intellect and inevitability. The film's companion piece, Flags of Our Fathers, viewed the same battle through American eyes. Two sides of one tragedy, two truths separated by language but united in suffering. Together, they helped audiences worldwide see that the line between heroism and futility is often only drawn by the outcome of war. To modern Japan, Kuribayashi's name stands alongside those of the few military leaders remembered with respect rather than fanatical devotion. He symbolizes an older kind of patriotism, one rooted not in aggression, but in responsibility. While others sought glory, he sought effectiveness. While others demanded sacrifice, he demanded discipline. His defense of Iwo Jima was doomed from the start, yet it remains one of the most tactically brilliant last stands in military history. American generals, including Holland Smith and Nimitz, later acknowledged his genius. Nimitz famously said of the Marines who fought there, "Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue." But that statement, intentionally or not, also reflected the valor of the men who opposed them. Today, when Japanese cadets study leadership, Kuribayashi's letters and orders are often cited as examples of integrity and foresight. He refused to allow suicide attacks within his command. He forbade cruelty toward prisoners. He treated subordinates with respect even in the face of death. In a war dominated by brutality, his humanity shone through, a quiet protest against the madness consuming his nation. In many ways, he embodied what Japan would later strive to become, a disciplined, resilient nation devoted to rebuilding, not destroying. The ground of Iwo Jima still shifts from volcanic heat, And sometimes, after heavy rain, bones resurface, white against the black sand. Excavation teams from both countries continue to recover remains, giving names to the nameless. Each skull found is a reminder that beneath flags and strategies, war is made of individual lives, young men who laughed, wrote letters, dreamed of going home. Kuribayashi's own remains were never identified, but perhaps that is fitting. He lies among his soldiers, indistinguishable from them, as he wished to be. 80 years later, Iwo Jima stands not just as a battlefield, but as a warning carved into the earth. It tells of what happens when pride overrides peace, when intelligence is silenced by ideology. It reminds the world that courage without purpose becomes tragedy, and that even in defeat, humanity can endure. General Kuribayashi did not win his battle, but he preserved something far greater: the dignity of the soldier, the sanity of leadership, and the enduring truth that war, in the end, destroys all sides equally. And so the story of Iwo Jima is not one of victory or defeat, but of remembrance. On that 8-square-mile island, the spirits of enemies once bound by hatred now rest side by side beneath the volcanic dust. The waves that crash on its black shores carry no sound of gunfire now, only the whisper of history, echoing Kuribayashi's final vow. May the next generation learn from our silence.